All right, everyone, let's get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to Workshop Wednesday. We're glad to have you all here with us to talk about the experiences of international scientists all over the world. Before we kickstart today's conversation with our panelists, I wanted to briefly introduce the people and the work behind this workshop and the entire Workshop Wednesday series, as well as tell you about the general flow of today's event. Today's workshop has been organized by GSA's Career Development Subcommittee. Antonia and I, Andrella, we have put together the blueprint of this event, but every member of the committee has been instrumental in making this event happen. Also, a special thanks to Jessica, the program assistant for the Early Career Leadership Program, for providing us with essential technical support and coordination to our planning. The Career Development Subcommittee works to build relationships with professionals and companies in the larger scientific community to create deeper connections with the society and its members and to highlight the versatility of career pathways open to all of you. The aim of today's workshop is to highlight how some of these tasks gain special nuances when applied to the experience of scientists working abroad. To learn more about the work that our team does, I encourage all of you to check out the Decoding Life interview series posted on GSA's Genes to Genomes blog. Last but not the least, I want to share a few notes and ground rules with everyone in attendance today. Please note that all views and opinions shared in today's workshop are those of the panelists themselves and not the companies that they represent or have worked for. In addition, any mention of a company by a panelist is not an endorsement for that given company or brand. This workshop is a safe space, so you are welcome to be vulnerable and ask questions to our panelists by dropping them in the chat box. On the flip side of that, if you're being disrespectful in this space, we will ask you to leave the workshop, so please be mindful of others. Also, given the complexity and specificity of the situation that characterize the legal status of each scientist working abroad, we ask you to refrain from submitting very detailed questions exclusively pertaining to your individual situation. None of our panelists in this context can provide specific answers to such inquiries. Members of our committee will be collecting questions from the chat box, and if they are not addressed in today's discussion, please don't worry. We will make sure to provide answers after the workshop in the form of a resource package. We welcome you to be present in the event, so don't feel that you need to frantically write down notes or resources. JSA will be sharing in the chat box all the resources that are mentioned today as the panelists speak about them as we go. When we will then compile all the links in a document and send it to all the participants after the workshop. Also, you can join us in our live career development chat on Twitter with the hashtag GSACareerDev. So let's begin today's discussion by first allowing our panelists to introduce themselves, to briefly tell us what they do and how they got to their current position. So let's start first with Lakshmi Sundararajan from Nashville Biosciences. Lakshmi, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to be a panelist. So originally, I'm from South India. I did my BTech biotechnology in there, and then after my 4-year course, I came to the US to do my PhD in molecular biosciences, and then my PhD was from University of Kansas. Once I did that, I moved on to Nashville, to Vanderbilt University to carry out my postdoc in a very similar field of neurodevelopment. And then after a 4-year postdoc, 4 to 5 year postdoc, I decided to enter into the field of genomics because the Vanderbilt system is so rich with both patient clinical information and a combination of genetics. So that really interested me. I did an internship with a company called Nashville Biosciences, which is a company owned by Vanderbilt. And then I ended up joining there as a full-time employee and as a genomics scientist. And I'm happy to talk to you all about my experiences today.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. Next, we have Mark Cronan from Max Planck Institute for Infection Biology. Mark, please introduce yourself.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Mark, and thanks so much to the committee for inviting me. It's a real delight to be here and be able to talk to you. So I'm a group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Infection Biology in Berlin. Before moving to Europe, though, I was actually, I'm an American and I'm a US-based scientist. So I originally did my graduate work in Gary Johnson's lab at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I worked on cancer research. And then I did a complete shift and started working on the zebrafish and working on tuberculosis pathogenesis and granuloma formation with Dr. David Tobin at Duke University. And through that process, I decided to look at academic jobs and decided to interview, and interviewed everywhere around the world, and ended up coming here to Berlin, where I'm now setting up my group. I started here in February, and I'm setting up my group working on, again, tuberculosis pathogenesis, and particularly on granuloma formation. So.
Thank you so much, Mark, for telling us about your journey. Next, we have Madeline Cronan from Iandoli Desai and Cronin. Madeline, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Madeline Cronin. I'm an immigration attorney. I've been practicing for about 20 years. And right after law school, I went right into immigration law. And I think I've always had an interest. My parents came to the United States in the late 50s from Korea, and struggled for quite a while before they came as students, and they struggled for quite a while until they got their permanent residence. So I've always been drawn to immigration work, and I help researchers, physician researchers, clinicians, business people with visa issues, and also family immigration and naturalization. So thank you.
Thank you, Madeline, for telling us about yourself. So we're going to begin today's Q&A session. These are questions that we had already previously collected through surveys and registrations. So the first set of questions are more focused on making the big move to a foreign institution. And the question is for both Mark and Lakshmi. The question is, how did your journey in abroad begin, and what pushed you to make the jump? Lakshmi, can you please answer that for us first, and then we will hear from Mark.
So, I mean, ever since I started, I mean, my high school, I knew that I wanted to be in the sciences. I really was very, very interested in genetics, neurodevelopment. I knew the focus that I wanted to take with my career. And that's why I went into a 4-year program in India, which is where you can finish that, and it's a lot easier to apply to the US. And I knew that the kind of resources that I needed to pursue a career in the sciences was more widely available in the US when compared to India, at least at that time. I mean, I've been in the US since 2008. Things are a lot different now in India in terms of resources available, but at that time there were very few universities. PhD was a lot more cumbersome to achieve, and the technology, the gap of the technology in the US versus India was so different. So I knew right off the bat that this is what I wanted to do. So I planned for it for my 4 years. I applied to all the exams, and I knew that this was the only way I could pursue a career in science. And of course, I was really supported by my family. So I was able to apply here for grad school. That's how I made it.
Thank you, Lakshmi, for telling us that. I'm going to follow up with you on that. So when you were applying to US, were there any specific agencies or resources that you resorted for guidance? Like, how did you select which host institution you want to pursue your studies in? Or were there any specific resources or maybe online websites that you referred to?
Again, online was very different at the time when I applied. This is over 12 years ago. There weren't as many boards, forums, social media was not as frequent, but there was some information available, and I just made sure I asked a lot of people. I looked for universities that had an international population, because that means those universities are more receptive and more, it'll be easier for me to adapt once I come to those universities. So I made sure there was a decent international population in those universities. Other determinations I made were based on the livability of the city. So very expensive cities I did not want to go to, because I had an assistantship. I did not want to spend too much of the pocket at that point of time. So these were some decisions I had already made. So I did not go with an agency. I knew I was applying for a PhD. Usually going with an agency is helpful when you're doing a master's, when you're applying for a larger number of universities. So I knew I was going for a PhD, so I was only applying to 4 or 5 universities, just very targeted. And so those were the determinations I made, just to make sure there was an international organization. There were professors and research that I liked, and the city was affordable.
Thank you so much for telling us that. I often find students asking the same question, that what sort of criteria should you consider when you're applying? I just want to have one last follow-up to that. So even when you were applying for a job, again, how did you choose your job position?
My current job was entirely based on interest. So I was looking at the future. Right now, genetics is the way to go everywhere. Everyone's getting their DNA sequenced. There's a DNA bank everywhere, but very few times DNA information is linked to such robust clinical information. Usually 23andMe and genome banks like that, a lot of people submit their DNA, but a lot of the data that they have, clinical data they have, is self-reported, meaning people report conditions, but a Vanderbilt system is a hospital. So it has a very detailed clinical information. The EMRs are very detailed. They have doctor's notes. They have a wide, rich variety of information and retrospective information that is de-identified. So it's not, it doesn't interfere with any of the HIPAA rules or any of that. And we have DNA linked to these people in this particular system. And we have over 20 years of data here with about 3 million people enrolled in this. So it's such a rich database. And once I came to Vanderbilt, I just recognized the importance of this and my focus changed. And so once I started working and I wanted to be at a place where I understood the forefront of research. So what are pharmaceutical companies doing right now? And I wanted to be at a place where research started. So not at the end of research, not where drug development or drug testing happens. I wanted to be at the start where hypotheses are generated based on retrospective data and understanding genetics. So I started with that interest, and it was a lot easier because once you go to a community that is so research focused, such as Vanderbilt, you get a lot of opportunities.
I'm so glad to hear about that. Mark, can you tell us about the same? How did you make your move to Berlin? Based on what criteria did you select the institution, and were there any resources that you resorted to?
So I already sort of gave you some of the background of this, but when I started out, it wasn't really a conscious decision to start a lab specifically in Europe. I knew I wanted to start my own research group. I wanted to be a PI, and I wanted to find the right place for me and the right sort of home for my research. And I knew I wanted to be very research focused, not as much on the teaching aspect. And so that really shaped where I applied, sort of R1 bigger institutions with a large research footprint. And so I ended up doing a broad search. I looked in the US and Canada and Europe. I probably looked the most in the US simply because it was the system that I knew the most about. But when I went out for interviews and interviewed here at the MPI for infection biology, I really like the environment. It's a very sort of diverse group of pathogenesis people, and just a good group of researchers. And also there was sort of this really exciting sort of revamping of the Institute as well. So the Institute had for 15 or 20 years had 3 directors, and directors are sort of the most senior position. If you see someone in your field who's a big name who works at an MPI, they're a director there. And they have a ton of resources. So 2 of them had hit mandatory retirement age. There's a big difference between Germany and the US. But yeah, they'd hit mandatory retirement age, and the MPI had decided, the infection biology MPI had decided, rather than hiring new directors, that they would hire a number of us younger group leaders, is what we're called. So they hired a total of 7 of us, and the first one started, Marcus Taylor started about 1.5 years, 2 years before I did. And then there are a bunch of us starting right now. So we have this very exciting sort of new youth movement that's starting in the Institute. And so that was sort of a really fun environment. It seemed like a really good environment to be a part of. And so far it has been a very good environment to be a part of. And we're all very diverse, but we're all doing a lot of very cool stuff that we have a lot of overlap and a lot of differences. Then another big point with the MPI, and this is true of some other research institutions in Europe, as well as some institutions in the US. But the MPI really supports your research. And so basically for the next 9 years, there I have a lab of 4 or 5 people and research funds to run that lab. I can write grants for more if I want to have more people, but I'm guaranteed for basically for the next 9 years to be funded. And so again, there are other places that do it. Obviously, it's pretty rare in the U.S., but particularly in Europe, there are some places that do it. And so that gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of structure to do the research that you want to do, and not worry about, you know, is NIH going to find it interesting? Are you going to be able to fund it? And so there was a combination of new movement and just a lot of freedom. And so those were really the big things that appealed to me. I think also it's really exciting on a personal level to be in Europe and to be in a city like Berlin that's really cool, and to just be able, you know, as someone who grew up in America, whenever you come over to Europe, it's, you know, it's a big deal. You've got to fly over. It takes 7 or 8 hours. You're jet lagged. Whereas here, you know, you can just go for a weekend to, you know, to Austria if you want to, or you know, hop a quick flight to Italy. So so I think as well on a personal level, it's a very exciting thing for us to be able to have that sort of freedom to live and travel here. In terms of how I selected it, as sort of a all the above approach. So, you know, Twitter, of course, you see a lot of job ads posted on Twitter these days, and that can always be a good way. But also reach out to friends and reach out to, you know, PIs, acquaintances at other institutions that you know in your field, and tell them to let you know if they have a job or if they know anyone in your field who's hiring. In this particular case, actually, you know, a friend of our labs, actually, she emailed me and sent me this job posting. So that's sort of how that happened. And then I ended up doing a lot of searches on the standard sort of science careers and nature jobs website. And just to sort of a general tip of something that I noticed is, and that I've heard from other people, is science careers tends to skew towards the US. More of the US jobs are advertised there, whereas nature jobs tends to be more European jobs. So, so yeah, but those are, you know, a great place to find a lot of jobs.
Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing so many resources and really highlighting some of the important criteria that you should consider when you're selecting an institution, such as how supportive it is. Could be funding resources, and also really important how the work environment is. The next question that we have here is, how hard is or was your experience with the visa process? So Lakshmi, why don't you tell us, and more specific to your job or work visa, because I believe your student visa application was something which was, you know, many years back. So we would want to know how that process was for you.
Okay, so when I applied for my postdoc, of course, I was on the OPT, F1 OPT, and I stayed on the OPT as much as possible because my professor was willing, and universities have this rule where they only apply for your H1 after you exhaust your OPT, because it doesn't really fall under the lottery system like the H1B does. So you are in a slightly different position. So I stayed on the OPT entirely. But then my situation slightly changed because I started I met my husband and we got married, and his job sponsored his EB-1B green card. So permanent residency, it just worked out right around the time I was applying for my H-1B through the university. We also got married and he got his green card processed. I mean, his 140 processed really quickly since we expedited it. And then we applied for the 485 change of status together. So I was able to get my green card, which I consider myself, it's a very lucky thing. It's not something that everyone has this option open. And that really changed prospects for me. Another note is Vanderbilt as a system has a lot of international students, and the Biological Research Office is very supportive of international students with various visa status to do internships. For me, that was the way I found my job, is to do an internship and figure out which way I wanted to go. Once I figured out academia was not panning out exactly the way I wanted in my postdoc, this was the way I wanted to go, and an internship was very paramount. So my advice would be not to fear the current visa status, and to talk extensively with your international student associations and biological research offices. These days, the biological research offices are well informed about visa status, and they usually have a person in charge of to deal with international visa statuses, and they can definitely help you with internships, even though the process will not be as smooth. There are some other classes to be applied, but these are a lot better automated these days, and information is available readily. And to not give up on internship and other opportunities because you think your visa will limit you from doing that.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. You brought up a really good point that to always stay in touch with immigration teams at your institution, because they are the ones who will make sure that you are in compliance with all the policies, and also help you to find various opportunities which help you to be more eligible for a specific visa status. Mark, why don't you tell us how was your visa process? Because I'm sure a lot of attendees will be interested in knowing the other side of the story.
So I think for me, honestly, it's been pretty straightforward. I think in general, the EU is pretty welcoming, and same for Germany. And with Germany, from what I understand, pretty much if you have a job and you have a working contract, working contracts are very sacred here. But if you have a working contract, generally you can get a visa. So, and I think too, being an institution like the MPI, where there's a lot of administrative support, it was really painless. Basically, I mean, I think I had to register a address here in Berlin, get health insurance, and complete a visa application, and then go to the foreign office. And I've got what's called a blue card. They originally named it that, the idea being that it's sort of the EU's equivalent of the green card. It isn't really. Basically, it's just I have resident status here basically for I think about 5 years, but after 3 years, if I want to, I could apply for permanent resident status within Germany. And actually, if you have enough proficiency with the German language, you can even apply after 2 years. So, so in general, much easier and much less fussy here. The blue card, I think, does come with some, you have to make a certain amount of money to qualify for it. It's actually lowered for people who are in the sciences. So I think it's actually pretty straightforward for people in the sciences to qualify for it. But again, it was very straightforward. So.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'm glad to know that for both of you, the process was fairly smooth. Since we're talking about visas and we have an expert here who's Madeline, we want to know from you what sort of, especially when you're moving to US, or maybe even the other way around, what sort of complications or challenges can it entail in terms of visa? And what are some of the alternative options that, as students or employees, we do have access to?
Yeah, in terms of challenges, I think the main one is sponsorship. I think Lakshmi touched upon that she was able to be sponsored once her status was coming toward the end of OPT, STEM OPT. And so she could transition to a sponsored category, such as the workforce of professionals and scientists in the United States, the H-1B, which is optimal to transition to green card. It allows very good ability to travel, although travel is a problem for everybody right now. But normally the H-1B allows travel more readily without a problem, versus F or J. If you want to immigrate to the United States, it's risky to travel. So I think in terms of sponsorship versus non-sponsorship, the sponsorship, of course, has those benefits. The benefits of the H-1B, the benefits of Another category, such as, again, Lakshmi mentioned, the outstanding researcher category, which if qualified is one of the more straightforward and highest percentages of approval by the Immigration Service. If you're not sponsored, you know, then a lot of postdocs that I meet say, well, I can't get sponsored. What should I do? Should I just go for the green card? You know, look at my CV. What do you think? And if it's a strong CV and they really, the goal is to stay in the United States, they really do want to keep their position or keep pursuing science in the US, then I just warn them that they can't travel while the process is going on. I guess a positive is that they can be self-sponsored. So in a sense, it's negative that they can't get sponsored, but in a way, it's positive that they have more freedom and they're not tied to the job that the sponsoring employer that's sponsoring them. So that's some of the pros and cons of people that have no sponsorship versus sponsorship. And I think just a challenge these days is the, you know, the categories are still the same, but some of the adjudications are more strict. You know, it depends on who you get. But if the person meets the criteria and, you know, they have a good case, then can be pursued for sure.
Thank you so much, Madeline. I think you spoke some aspects of academia. How does this affect when you're in an industrial job position, when your company is sponsoring your H-1B visa versus if it isn't and you need to approach some private agencies? What sort of challenges does that entail and how can you overcome that?
Well, again, as Lakshmi also referred to, in terms of universities and organizations such as teaching hospitals that are affiliated with universities, they're called cap exempt. Otherwise, if it's private industry, every year in March now, there's a registration period. And this was the first time last year that this happened for the month of March. And it's much cheaper. You don't have to file or hire an immigration attorney. And if you do, it's a lot less money because it's just a entry into this registration. And then a lottery is run, and by May, you should know if your company that's sponsoring you, you've been selected. Again, there is no self-employment per se on H-1B, so that is a difficulty that a lot of people face, especially entrepreneurial types that may want to start a company. When you're on 12 months of OPT, you can start your own company and you can be your own boss. STEM OPT, you cannot, as probably a lot of the listeners know. So then there's that transition period of becoming an employee and being sponsored by the private entity, even the private entity that you started. You may have to have partners that are you know, going to sign off on your documents and say that you're the employee of the company. Decrease your shares, or for example. So these are some of the issues that come up with private sponsorship. But the main thing is the lottery. And then if you're not selected in the lottery, for people that are on STEM OPT that may have, I've definitely worked with people that have tried 3 times, and you know, maybe on the 3rd time they're selected in the lottery for the company. And then if the company is also willing to sponsor for green card, and then that's another process to transition from H-1B of the private company to the green card sponsored by the company.
Thank you so much, Madeline. I'm going to have a follow-up question on that. So in case your H-1B doesn't get picked up and when you're applying again, so at that point of time, how do you advise your the employer or the student? Do they do some sort of, you know, improvement in their CV or maybe search for other opportunities which make them more eligible?
Well, the H-1B is really, the basic rule is that it's a position that normally requires a bachelor's degree at a minimum and a specialized degree. It can't just be a liberal arts degree. It has to be a focused major that the job normally requires, like an accounting degree for an accountant. So if the person isn't selected, which is I think what you were asking, then you know what to do. They have to apply again and hopefully have more time left in their temporary stay as either F, J, or some other category that will allow them to, the employer, more time to apply for the lottery next year. Or maybe it's a situation where they qualify for a green card category and that can be done in parallel. because the main thing to transition from a temporary status to a green card status is you have to be in a legal status. So for some people, as I mentioned, like the F or J that are running out of time, they may just say, look, I couldn't get selected, or I don't have a sponsor. I'm just going to go for the green card now while I'm still in F or J status and file my green card application. Because once it's filed, you're in a legal status waiting for the green card. And so that puts you in a holding pattern, and you also have work and travel ability while the green card's pending.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I'm glad to know that there are always options and other alternatives that you can do there. It could be challenging, but there's always a way to make things work.
Try.
Yeah. Sorry, sure.
Yeah. I think I just know this because my husband lottery fell through, and his job was able to sponsor an O1 visa for him, which was another way he was able to get the visa transition between H-1B, the time of expiration of his STEM OPT, and then starting to apply for green card. Usually sometimes these deadlines are so tight. So his OPT was running out. He'd lost the lottery 2 times. So he needed visa status to stay and then apply for his green card, because just accumulating details for a green card takes a little bit of time. You need references, you need a lot of other details to be worked out usually. So his company was able to sponsor O1, which is, I think Madeline might be able to give you more idea, but it's usually similar to H1, but more tied to your job, and you have to have a unique qualification and other details to qualify for that. But it is another alternative that you have.
Thanks, Lakshmi, for sharing that information. Madeline, can you tell us what is this O1 visa and what are some of the criteria for that?
Sure. I think this would have come up in the next couple of questions, but as I mentioned before, if there is no other status and F and J are running out, you do need to you need to be in some legal status. In terms of the O1, it is much more demanding than the H-1B. You have to meet at least 3 criteria out of 8 typically, or 10 if you're in the arts. For the postdoc researchers and physician scientists, out of the 8, the first is if you have a major prize, such as the Nobel Prize. And usually a lot of people chuckle because not many people have a Nobel Prize in their pocket. So they have the 3 alternatives. And there's, I would say every O1, you should have an ability to say that you've made a major and original contribution in your field. And you have to define your field to the Immigration Service. It can be, if it's too broad, such as cancer research, because the claim is that O1 is that you're a person of extraordinary ability, that you're at the top few percentages of this field. And so maybe you do genetics for cancer research or something like that, but there's a theme to the O1. So you have to demonstrate that you've made an original and significant contribution, and usually that is through expert letters. A lot of people say, well, how many do I need? I would say it's more quality than quantity. I don't think 1, though, is enough. I think anywhere from 6+ is good, and again, depending on the quality. They shouldn't really be repetitive. They should talk about your contributions in different ways. So that's one criteria that's normally all O1 should have. Scholarly work, whether it's conference paper presentations, book chapter, journal publications. And another usual one we see is if you've been a referee or a reviewer of publications, manuscripts. If you have those in your name, that fulfills another criteria. Others are less common are media, usually media about you though. It has to be naming you. They're very specific. Others are if you're in a leading or senior role in a leading institution or an institution of distinguished reputation. And I'm sure most of all the people on this call are, but you have to demonstrate that you're in a leading role. A lesser common one is if you're making a lot of money as compared to your peers. That's usually not a typical one. So I would say in terms of looking at the O1 criteria, as Lakshmi mentioned, it is usually quite a lot of work because you have to gather expert letters, you have to make sure you have your publications, they look at citation count, again, to show that you've made original and significant contributions. So in terms of people that are maybe just starting out, what we try to say is if you can make networking contacts where you could get people in your field to support you and get to know your work at conferences, for example, or people email you and say, hey, I noticed something about your work. Those are very valuable as well. People in private industry are very helpful, people in the US as well as overseas. The O1 is for showing extraordinary ability either on a national basis or an international basis. It doesn't have to be only international. So contacts abroad are helpful as well. But if your work is only known in your own country and you've just come to the United States, but it's significant, that's still okay. But you do have to have a job offer, as Lakshmi mentioned, which is how her husband was able to bridge that time. The O1 permits 3 years initially and then 1 year per renewal. So, you know, it can take sometimes a long time for some people to go to the green card, and so the O1 may be a good bridge. It is a challenging one, as you can see. You do need a lot of evidence, but it definitely has come in handy. And for those people that are in J1 status that are subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, they can't apply for the H, they can't apply for the green card, and until they resolve that problem, a lot of people do go for the O1 to allow them to work in the country while they're either getting a J1 waiver or maybe even going home for 2 years on a cumulative basis to resolve the 2-year home residency requirement. So
thank you so much for giving us all the details. Right, sure. We're going to move on to talking about some of the cultural and language barriers when you move to a foreign institution. But before that, I just want to remind everyone and our panelists, there are a lot of questions that are coming in the chat box. So if you want, you can answer them there as well. So the question is, how did you deal with a new cultural environment and language barrier? What sort of strategies did you employ to kind of overcome problems? Lakshmi, why don't you answer that first for us, and then we'll hear from Mark.
Yeah, I mean, when you come in initially as a 21-year-old post-college student, it's a little intimidating to come to a place that's completely new. So like I mentioned, one thing I did is to look for some amount of familiarity. So contact people who, contact other international students, hopefully Indians. There are a lot of people and that was something I used as a criteria to even go to a particular school. So that gave me a sense of familiarity. I was able to talk to alumni there. There were certain specific questions that are more centered around where you come from, the country you come from. So those questions are easily answered by people who are already there and are maybe in their 3rd year or 4th year in those places. So that's very helpful. And they also help you with certain details, such as setting up bank accounts, setting up or answering your very basic questions. What do you need to bring? These are things that are not useful. These are things that are useful. So if this is something as I mentioned, things are a little different from your home country, and there are things you want to bring that keeps you familiar, keeps things familiar, keeps you grounded. So those are things that people here can give you some pointers on. So this is something that will never be available. Just bring it. Even if it's something for cooking, or just bring it. It'll be helpful for you. So those are things I was able to do. Then the class that I got into grad school had a large international population. So I was able to contact a lot of them earlier and then meet up with them at my, back when I was in India, meet in person. So it was helpful to have that contact before you go there. Helped also talk about the roommate situation, those kind of things. So a lot of preparation beforehand. So reading up about the place, trying to be as familiar as possible. And then another thing I did was contact a lot of professors. So that was I was able to take help of alumni. So if there were labs I was interested in, I talked to people who were currently in that lab and people who had left the lab. Once I did that, that gave me an idea of how things work in a research environment. And once I did those contacts, I was able to, once I went to the university, there's usually a couple of weeks where you're really not doing anything much. So I was able to set up meetings, go talk to professors in person. Again, help me just integrate better into the university and be a little familiar. So those were things that really helped me, at least when I started initially.
Thanks, Lakshmi. You brought up a really good point that obviously finding a community, even when you're applying and reaching out to people, asking the right questions really helps. And as you mentioned, the community really helps you in different ways, whether it's, setting up a bank account or even bringing things for cooking. I still remember one of the Indian associations sending me a letter which clearly said, please bring a pressure cooker. And being an Indian, you know how important that is. So definitely finding a community helps. Mark, why don't you tell us, how was your experience in Berlin? Did you face any cultural language barriers, and how did you overcome that?
Well, so it's still a work in progress. Haven't been here too long, so I'm still adapting. But I think first off, I think I've been really lucky ending up in a city like Berlin, which is really multinational, and so unfortunately, my German, to put it politely, is still a work in progress. But it's something that I'm working on and taking classes. But particularly with the multinational nature of Berlin, you can really get by with some bad German and some English when you need to. Most people can help out a little bit, so it's very kind of them. On the language front for Berlin, it's a good place, and also. I was a little nervous about it when I moved here, but with the MPI is all run both in German and English simultaneously. A lot of emails will actually have German on one part, and then they'll have English down below. And so it's a place where really, as an English speaker, you're okay. Most people speak English. There are some people who maybe don't speak as much English as others, but you can always work your way around it and figure it out. And so I think it's a place where, as an English speaker, it's okay. So yeah, for the language barrier, it's something to be worked on, but particularly with science, of course, with English being the language of science, you can generally find your way. In terms of culture, again, still learning. I think the biggest thing is, just ask, especially early on. I'm not always as good about asking as I should be, but it's one thing that I always have to remind myself. People know that, you don't know what to do. And generally, most people are quite friendly and quite willing to help you out if you ask. And so don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And then more than that, I think just trying to be open-minded and know that it's going to be different, and know there are going to be some things that you run into where, you're sort of looking at it and you're like, why is it this way? But it just is, and you just have to change the way you do things. So, it's there's always, German bureaucracy is kind of a cliche, but there's also some truth to it, as everyone here will also acknowledge. And I think once you figure out which things, for instance, here in Germany, where there are certain things that are very bureaucratic, you just have to know to, start it a little bit earlier and make sure you have every I dotted and every T crossed. And as long as you do that, everything's fine. So I think, yeah, just keep an open mind and ask a lot of questions. And yeah.
Thanks, Mark, for telling us that. And I'm glad that you're settling in. And yes, asking questions is really important. That's what really helps you to integrate into any new system. While we're talking about challenges, we're going to move on to the next question, which is for Madeline. The question is, while you're in the US, whom should you approach to maintain your legal status and always ensure that you're in compliance with the policies, especially when the circumstances are very uncertain and things are changing? Is it a good idea to always stay in touch with the immigration team in your immediate institution, or having some contacts with an immigration attorney is more helpful?
Well, I think that it was touched upon before, and normally when I do give some presentations at institutions that I help, there is someone from the international office on hand, because they certainly want to reiterate how important it is for all J1 scholars, for example, F1 students, to be in touch with the international office at all times with regard to travel, or if there is a problem where there's going to be an ability to work or continue studies. So that's basic, critical, to always keep in touch with your institution about any challenges you're facing and travel, for example. In terms of whether you should talk to someone outside of the school, when I assist an organization and say for sponsoring somebody, I represent both the institution and the foreign national, so it's dual representation. If the institution is not able to sponsor the person because maybe it's a grant-funded position, a temporary position, then usually there is the advice of the institution itself even for the person to go seek some assistance and take what information they may have and see, maybe to talk to a private counsel and see what the situation is and how they can obtain a green card, or if the J1 stay is going to end soon, what they should be doing if they want to continue in the United States. So normally if it's all institution-based, it should all go to the international office. And then once that sponsorship is coming to a close, or even way ahead, a year or two ahead, to do some advanced planning, it would be helpful to talk to someone about status.
Thank you, Madeline. Sure. Thank you for answering that. While we are at it, let's move on to the next question, which actually a follow-up question to that. So when you're applying, or say not applying, but when you're in the US, or maybe just in general, when the situations are very uncertain, and as you mentioned, being in touch with the immigration team at the institution is very helpful, but when you're emailing them frantically in the middle of the night because you see something on Twitter and they are taking time to get back to you because they don't have staff at that time, are there any online resources that we can resort to and kind of reduce that anxiety?
Yeah, actually, in light of that question, I mean, this sounds like a plug for ourselves, but we have a newsletter, but it comes out every month. But a good resource is the American Immigration Lawyers Association, which is I'm a member of, and of course I get blasts every day of the top 8 issues coming across for all types of immigration issues, whether it's asylum all the way to business immigration. But I noticed on the website, it is members of the public can access AILA, American Immigration Lawyers Association. You don't have to pay the membership fee, and you don't have the depth of access that I might have, but you do have the public resources available, and there's quite a bit. And so I think in terms of a reliable, the American Immigration Lawyers Association is a great resource, and something that you can sign on to as a member of the public and get information on a regular basis, or I think even do searches within their database for information.
Thank you so much for telling us that. This has been a very common question. People asking what is one sort of database that you can reach out to. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to follow up with you on another important question which attendees have been asking is, one is, how can you proactively facilitate your professional growth as a visa holder? I know some of you touched upon looking for opportunities and asking the immigration team about it and looking for assistance, but proactively, what sort of opportunities you should look for to make you eligible for a particular visa status? And also a very important question is, how hard is it to make it without permanent residency? Is it possible?
Well, I think ultimately, a lot of people ask me that. What do I have to do? What specific things should I do? And I think the most important thing is as people, we all have to ask ourselves, what do we want to do as our careers work? Mark's mentioned some of his desire, and it ended up taking him to Germany. Lakshmi here in the United States. I think the core idea is to determine what area that you're pursuing, and just know that if it's for permanent residence or the long haul, I think a lot of people tell me, well, gee, I can't get grants, I can't get more opportunities unless I'm a permanent resident. And I think for the most part, that's true, unfortunately. Unlike Mark's comment about his lab and how it's funded so well, it's more of a grant, competitive grant process here in the US. So I try to tell people this is the criteria. The criteria I touched upon is available all over the internet. And I think I forwarded to my usual presentation. That will be part of the resource. But I think the person has to determine what they want to do, and unfortunately, it takes a lot of work for some of these self-sponsored cases where you have to publish quite a bit, do networking. But I think for all of us in our careers, those are some of the typical things we have to do anyway. But I think that's probably the best. It doesn't sound like very specific advice for people. But I just try to say, focus on what you want to do in the US, not what you think immigration you have to do to get the green card, what you want to be doing here in your career. And then start accumulating the criteria that you need, judging, publishing if possible, working with developing your network and planning. It sounds like another plug, but we do look at quite a few CVs for people. I just throw that out there. But honestly, if it's a goal to stay here, you really should meet with someone and try to do some planning. I hope that's helpful. If not, please follow up with any questions, or I'm glad to answer some later for other people.
No, sure, that's definitely helpful. And as we mentioned, whatever resources we have collected today, or as Madeline mentioned, she has already forwarded us some information. We will be putting that together in the form of a resource package and providing to all our attendees. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to move on to some questions for Mark and Lakshmi. The question is more about your personal experiences abroad. So it is, were there any aspects of your professional or personal life abroad that ever made you think that you want to go back to your home country? Lakshmi, can you please answer that for us, and then we will hear from Mark.
There are some parts of your professional growth that are hard, and it is tied in with being an international student. Like Madeline mentioned, the major hoop that you have to jump through in the US is applying for fellowships and for funding opportunities. And those are the things that really push your career towards an academia route. When I finished grad school, I really wanted to be in academia, and I really enjoyed research and thinking of projects, the whole spiel of being a PI. And with that goal, I started my postdoc. And the major hoop that I had to jump through is funding opportunities. And since you're not eligible for a majority of the NIH and K01 awards, you are eligible for the K99 ROO, which is this award that you get in your postdoc. You have to apply by your third year, and it funds you 2 + 3 years. So it gives you time to finish up your postdoc, and then gives you funding for the start of your career as an assistant professor. But those awards are extremely competitive. In fact, we had a program officer from neurobiology from NIH come and talk to us and tell us that the whole purpose of them having a K99 ROO is to select what they termed as superstars. So people who have only published in high-profile journals, Nature, Cell, and who have these multiple high-impact publications, who've had preliminary grants. So those are the people they are looking to shape into academia. So when you have that kind of profile, and there are so many PhDs in these fields, it gets a little discouraging. But I have to be honest. There are funding opportunities for international students. It's just a matter of really being proactive. Something that Madeline mentioned is to keep planning at it. You may or may not be successful, but there are things like American Heart Association. There are other non-government funding agencies. And what really helped in Vanderbilt is that they had a great biology research office. So they had a list of all the fellowships that were available, the cycles of funding, application dates, those kind of things. And then they also had committees that peer reviewed people's fellowships. So postdoctoral associations are very helpful in that case. So it kind of gives you a direction where to go. But it's always helpful to keep redefining what you want from your career. And when you are feeling discouraged because of either the way science works, the way research works, it's always good to keep exploring new opportunities. And that's what helped me, is to see science from a different perspective, that it's okay if you're not pursuing your initial goal. It doesn't make you a total failure. So you can review opportunities, which I did for both looking at opportunities in Europe, looking at opportunities in India, and looking at opportunities here. So trying to see if you can change or pivot a little bit. You don't have to give up everything, but then pivot and see if there are other interests you have, and change your focus a little bit. That really helped me.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. And you touched upon a really important point, which was about fellowships. And that's been another popular or common question. People are often worried that there are no fellowships open to international students or scientists. There are, in fact, as Lakshmi mentioned, it takes a little work to find them and reach out to the right people, to get in touch with them and to understand what the criteria are. But as long as you're motivated and dedicated, I'm sure that's what really helps you to overcome any of these challenges. Mark, why don't you tell us about your experience? Since your transition is more recent, was there any time you felt you wanted to come back to the US? And if so, how did you overcome that?
So I think there's always a lot of nostalgia for anywhere you come from, of course, and there have been some things that as you make the transition that are sort of rocky changes. I already sort of made the joke about bureaucracy, but it is true, and I think this is generally more true in the EU as well. As someone who works both with pathogens and also with animal models, there are, for instance, a lot more regulations and a lot more specifics that you have to talk about here that you don't have to deal with in the US. But I think a lot of that is just, it's part of just transitioning to a new culture and a new approach. And, a lot of it is just sort of changing your headspace and reminding yourself to not expect it to be like the US or wherever you're from, or whatever you did your science from. And I think the big thing is really I can do science really well here, and that's the important thing. So keep that in mind. And there will of course be some things I'm nostalgic about for the US, but so far no real regrets. It's been a good transition, and it's been I think it's really a great situation that I've ended up in. And so whenever I get hit with some of the hard stuff, I just have to remind myself that overall this is a pretty perfect situation. So yeah.
Well, I'm really glad to know that has worked for you. I'm just going to ask, we just have 2 minutes left. I'm going to just ask one last follow-up to you, Mark. Do you think so far your experience has changed you in any way as a person, both personal or at a professional level?
Yeah, I think it's been good for me. I think as a lot of us in science, I have a strong sort of perfectionist streak, and wanting to do things right and really caring about it. And I think one of the good things about moving somewhere new, especially somewhere where you don't really speak the language, is it just forces you to accept that things are different, and that you and just makes you better at accepting mistakes and growing and learning. And so yeah, I think it's been a really good transition to sort of take myself out of my comfort zone and put myself, you know, somewhere new where I have to adapt and improve. So yeah, it's been good, and it's and Berlin's like a really wonderful city to be in, and you know, it's been good to be in Germany as well. I think, you know, it's a country that values a lot of the same things that I value. So yeah.
Thank you so much for answering that. Our time here is up. So thank you all the panelists for answering all the questions. We have come to the end of today's workshop. Thank you all of us for joining us, and especially thank you to the panelists for taking out their time and to answer all the questions, sharing their experiences, and also providing their insights. Stay tuned for the next Workshop Wednesday event. Coming next in is a conversation about teaching in primarily undergraduate institutions, which is scheduled for November 4, 2020 at 1 p.m. EDT. Lastly, the Career Development Subcommittee will be putting together a resource package based on today's discussion. So please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and please check your email for updates as soon as we begin to distribute them. Thank you, everybody. Again, please take care and please stay safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us.
Take care, everybody.
Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.